What if the world's most powerful economy simply couldn't pay its bills? It sounds impossible, unthinkable. The United States prints the world's dominant currency, runs the most trusted financial system, and controls the backbone of global trade. So how could the country that issues the world's money ever run out of it? That's the assumption. But here's the mystery. In the last 50 years, the U.S. government has come dangerously close to default multiple times, so close that even a small delay nearly shook the global economy. And the next crisis may not be a near miss, because underneath the surface lies a system that is far more fragile. It's far more political and far more mathematical than most people realize. Today, we dive into a scenario that economists fear, politicians avoid, and world markets pray never comes true. What happens if the United States cannot pay its debt? And the real shock? The story doesn't start with money. It starts with something far more unpredictable: human behavior. Setting the stage, the system built on trust. To understand the danger, we need to step back far back to the birth of the U.S. financial system. When the U.S. government borrows money, it issues something called a treasury bond. These are considered the safest assets on earth. Countries buy them, banks store them, investors treat them as gold. But here's the twist. These safe assets are only safe because people believe the U.S. will always pay them back. That belief is the foundation of the global financial system. Without it, the system collapses. And yet the U.S. has been testing that belief again and again, pushing the limit higher, borrowing more, and relying on the world to trust it every single time. Today, the national debt is more than $34 trillion, growing faster than the economy itself. Every second, the number climbs. Every year, Washington spends more than it earns. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The U.S. doesn't pay old debt by saving money. It pays old debt by borrowing new money. This works until it doesn't, and history shows us exactly how fragile this system can become. Origins: how America learned to borrow. The story begins in the aftermath of World War II. The United States emerges as the world's economic powerhouse. Countries devastated by war trust the dollar because it's backed by real gold. But in the 1970s, things change. America is spending too much. Inflation rises. Gold reserves shrink. In 1971, President Richard Nixon breaks the dollar's link to gold. From that moment, U.S. debt is backed only by faith, and the government begins borrowing like never before. Debt becomes a tool, then a habit, then a dependency. By the 1980s, deficits explode. By the 2000s, wars and crises push borrowing to new records. By the 2020s, trillions are added in a matter of months. The U.S. is no longer just borrowing, it's living on borrowed money. And every system built on borrowing eventually reaches a breaking point. The rise when borrowing becomes the business model. Here's where the story gets more dramatic. The U.S. doesn't just borrow from its own citizens. It borrows from the whole world. China buys us debt. Japan buys us debt. Europe buys us debt. Why? Because they all rely on the dollar. Global trade uses dollars. Oil is priced in dollars. International banks hold dollar reserves. And all of this depends on the assumption that U.S. debt is untouchable. But in 2011, the U.S. government comes dangerously close to default during a political standoff over the debt ceiling. Markets panic, and ratings are downgraded. Investors run to safety ironically, buying more U.S. bonds because there's no alternative. The world dodges a bullet. Then it happens again in 2013, and again in 2023. The pattern repeats. Politics nearly destroys the system that money alone cannot fix. The breaking point: what if this time the U.S. can't pay? Let's imagine the unthinkable. Congress fails to raise the debt ceiling. Payments halt. Treasury bonds go unpaid. Hours later, the shockwaves begin. 1. Markets freeze. Treasury bonds are used as collateral in global financial transactions. If their value becomes uncertain, trillions of dollars in trades stop instantly. 2. Banks face catastrophic losses. Banks around the world hold U.S. bonds. A default could make their safest assets worthless, triggering a global banking crisis. 3. The dollar collapses. Without trust, the dollar loses its special status. Countries rush to dump U.S. debt. The currency plummets, making imports more expensive and inflation explode. 4. The U.S. government shuts down. Social security checks stop, military salaries halt, healthcare reimbursements freeze. Within days, the world faces an economic disaster bigger than 2008, because in 2008, the U.S. government saved the banking system, okay? But in a default, no one can save the savior. The fallout, a world without trust, economists often say, the world runs on trust. Take that trust away, and everything built on top of it falls. If the U.S. defaulted, even briefly, interest rates would skyrocket. Mortgages and loans would double or triple. Stock markets could crash by 30 to 50%. A recession could turn into a depression. Countries dependent on dollars, India, Brazil, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, would face chaos. Global trade would slow. Supply chains break. Investors retreat. This isn't just an American crisis. It's a global one. Because when the world's safest asset becomes unsafe, there is no plan B. Failed fixes. Why solutions don't work, you might wonder. Can't the government just print more money? Yes, but printing money to pay debt destroys trust even faster. It signals desperation. Could the U.S. cut spending? In theory, but politically, almost impossible. More than 70% of the budget goes to programs voters won't allow to be cut. Could taxes be raised? Maybe, but higher taxes slow the economy, making debt even harder to pay. Every solution creates a new problem. That's why the debt keeps rising and the clock keeps ticking. Modern parallels, the patterns are already repeating. If this feels theoretical, look around. Countries like Argentina, Greece, Lebanon, and Sri Lanka all collapsed for the same reason. Too much borrowing, too little trust, too much political fighting. Every collapse begins slowly, then suddenly. And the U.S. is showing the same early warning signs. Record inflation in 2002-2023. Rising interest payments consuming the budget. Political gridlock reaching new extremes. Debt rising faster than GDP for 20 years. Credit rating agencies issuing repeated warnings today. America pays nearly $1 trillion a year just in interest, the highest in history. For comparison, that's more than the entire U.S. defense budget. When interest becomes the largest expense of a country, a default isn't a question of if, but when. 3 takeaways is what this means for you. 1. Stability is an illusion. The world believes U.S. debt is safe because it always has been, but history shows trust can vanish overnight. 2. Debt is a chain that gets heavier over time. The more the U.S. borrows, the harder it becomes to escape the cycle. Eventually, the system buckles. 3. When America shakes, the world trembles. A U.S. default wouldn't just affect Americans. It would reshape global power, currency systems, and financial markets. Final warning, the question we must ask: every empire in history believed it was too big to fall. From Rome to Britain to the Soviet Union, power blinds leaders until reality forces them awake. Today, the U.S. faces a silent threat, not from war, not from rivals, but from its own finances. The question isn't just, what happens if the U.S. can't pay its debt? The real question is, what happens if the world stops believing that it can? Because once trust is broken, even the strongest foundations collapse. Call to action, naturally integrated. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, share this video. More people need to understand how close the world is to a crisis nobody wants to talk about. Hit like if you want more deep-dive documentaries on global finance, power, history, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter.